So Kristell, tell us all about it. First of all, what is a CSOps?
Well, a CSOps is someone who can help you articulate a lot of things in terms of playbooks and automations, which will help you from a hands-on point of view, as I like to say, but also from a strategic point of view. Obviously, there are many comparisons you can make if you've ever had the opportunity to compare with peers in marketing or in sales. The little hands, shall we say, well-known, who will help in your hotspot or your sales force when you're part of marketing or sales. For me, it's really going to be the strategic right-hand man of my role, the head of, the VP, the lead, call it what you will, who will ultimately enable you to implement and challenge everything you don't have time to do. It's essentially a question of bandwidth. I can see what makes a good CSO, i.e. You have to have been a CSM, etc. But for me, I really see it as a matter of knowledge. But for me, I really see it as a right-hand relationship for setting up whatever you'd like to do if you have the time.
So you would say that a CSOps in terms of expectations is more someone operational, someone strategic?
Both, sir. I don't see how I can have an operational person if they don't have the strategic vision to go and challenge certain issues. As far as I'm concerned, the person who's going to take on this role is obviously going to have to work on the scalable side. And I apologize in advance for all the anglicisms I'm going to use, but I'm going to use them depending on your business model and what you're addressing. We're in the recurring revenues as business, so we've got monthly, we've got yearly, we've got low touch, we've got high touch. So if this person doesn't understand this ecosystem, I think you're going to lose 6 or 7 months of onboarding. So this was also one of the criteria I used when choosing my CSO.
So you started to take the lead of the CS team in 2020. I was recruited a year ago in 2082. I started in January 2002. At what point did you say to yourself, I'm going to need a CSOps? And what did you have to do to integrate a CSOps into your team, knowing that, let's face it, it's a role that's really hard to define, especially in France?
It's really hard to define. I honestly think that, I'm sure I didn't even know the role existed when I took the job. There are some initial questions. Above all, in my case, when you make a move from support to SaaS, which can happen in many cases, basically the grain tank of people who do SaaS is half support, half SaaS, to put it simply, since SaaS is generally a fairly new business and department. Honestly, I didn't even know this role existed when I took it on. I was in a very artisanal mode, segmenting customers, simply recruiting CSMs, i.e. finding people who would look after our customers in different zones and languages, since we are pretty much all over the world. So all that was necessary in the beginning. In any case, I think that even if I was aware of the existence of this role, I perhaps also needed to feel for myself the problems I needed to solve with the creation of this position. Before creating the position, it's because I came up against problems that I understood what my pain was, and that my pain was going to be solved by someone who was going to take charge of it all. But if I hadn't run into these walls, we'll come back to that with the previous tool, with the data, with my time management, since that's not all I have to do. I don't think the path would have been possible before. I don't think I would have felt this need before.
And so at what point did you say to yourself, this is it, I've got to hire someone? And how did you get things moving internally? Because it's a budget to hire someone, whatever the budget. How did you go about, there you go, what was the process? Sorry.
The process from the end of the year, when I started recruiting, to when you joined us at the beginning of 2022, it was a very simple process. The trigger for all this was, on the one hand, the fact that I didn't have the time at all to maintain the few things I had put in place in terms of automation on our previous customer success tool, the fact that I didn't have my eyes riveted HXIV on this tool, I had other things to do. When there were things to do, I discovered them late in the day, so I needed that. So that was really the trigger when the team got big enough to have bigger problems in the end. It's like children. Little kid, little problem. Big kid, big problem. It's much the same with teams. When teams start getting bigger, you start running into problems. You start to get teams telling you it's time consuming, you need to automate it. I don't have the time, I'm high touch CSM, and so on. Not that I didn't have the vision or some vague idea of how things should be done, but I think there were people more qualified than me to do it, and it wasn't a good use of my time. So from that point on, you're going to pitch above yourself. In this case, it's the CEO of the company, and you explain to him your pain, you explain to him that it's no longer possible. The big advantage I had was that the customer success drive at Agorapulse was initiated directly by the CEO. So the customer success logic meant that after a while, having a customer success department was a basic necessity. And I never had to convince him of that. So maybe it was a little less difficult than in this company to convince him of the need to, I need to free up my time. I need to have a CSOps executive, someone who knows customer success, where I haven't reboarded him or her from scratch to explain to him or her what high touch is, what low touch is. It was moderately difficult, to be honest. I wouldn't say that in 2003 it would be as easy, because we're all perhaps a little more uptight at the moment with the crisis. But back then it was relatively simple. There's a lot of literature out there on job descriptions and things like that. It's starting to emerge in English at least. So from that point on, it was easy for me to convince people when I listed all the problems I didn't have time to deal with. It always comes down to the issues you want to resolve, and that was the big trigger in 2001.
Once the CSOps had been hired, what did you expect of me without talking about a mission? You know what the big challenges were?
There are several major challenges to overcome. First of all, in our case, it was a transition from one tool to another, since we had decided that the tool we were using wasn't right for us, and that there was some debate. Should we go for a customer success tool? Should we go for a CRM? We decided against it, etc. So in the end, that's the idea in our case, the project of a transition from one tool to another. This was clearly one of the assignments, if not the very first Mastodon assignment you had to work on. A lot of documentation. I think that's something you'd expect from an ops person. The ability to work with departments other than customer success. I don't think I'll ever have to convince you that customer success is the responsibility of everyone in the company. And so in the end, this ability to go and preach the good word, to go and help certain teams. Of course, you also need to be proactive. In the end, that's more on the soft skis, hard skis side of the job description. Personally, what I'm looking for is someone who's proactive on the different subjects, who's able to make proposals. Data-driven, that's obvious, but it goes without saying. Someone who's comfortable with data, who's comfortable talking to data people. So if there's chameleon profile who will be as comfortable talking to our head of data as to a customer success manager, I touch. That's another very important chameleon parameter. Finally, it's a job of relieving, if I can use the expression, the customer successes, automating time-consuming tasks, in a reactive way, being a source of proposals, sometimes shaking up the lines a little, moving the lines, seeing what works, seeing what doesn't work. It's also something important that I, in any case, expected from the person joining us.
You've done a lot of things. There are a lot of things that are clear, but we understand the expectations, but in the end, it's still a bit vague in terms of implementation. So if we talk specifically about the projects on which CSOps works, what type of project would you quote?
Yes, as I mentioned earlier, there's either the literal implementation of just about everything, i.e., if the CS, it depends on where you are in your customer success adventure. If there isn't yet, if you're still working with a spreadsheet and haven't yet implemented anything, there are obviously tool decision missions. I like to think that tools are not the solution. You shouldn't go there either. For some companies, and I've talked to some people using the CRM that is also used in marketing, and ESL will suffice. if you tweak a little HubSpot and so on. So the type of project is either the implementation of a CSM/CRM tool, or the transition from one tool to another if the tool we're working on is no longer adequate. That's what happened to us in one of your first missions when we had to make this transition. So we went to benchmarking alternatives, specifications. Well, that's where we start. Specifications, benchmarking, calls with the various salespeople and so on. After that, we set up the tool. Mapping of the day. Obviously, with the constraints you may have depending on your business model. If you're only high touch, if you're only low touch, you're spoiled, you've got both. So that way, at least you've got a bit of everything. So let's set up for the day. I get bored otherwise, you know. But yes, there you go. Otherwise, I know you won't know what to do with your days. Another example of a project you can work on, but it's really going to depend on the different companies. It's also going to be in cross-departmental collaboration. One of the examples we had in our case was the product managers who were struggling, literally struggling, to be in contact with customers, to get discovery calls, which they were still doing a little bit by hand using our intercom ticketing tool and so on. And so, for example, one of the tasks you took on was to help them to have scalable, sorry for the Anglicism, discovery calls according to the type of customer they wanted to talk to and so on. That's the type of mission that, in my case, you were able to work on.
I'd add, in terms of mission and type of project, all the projects you're working on, you'd like to work on, but you don't have the time because you've got your head on your shoulders. That's what a CSOps is going to do. That's what a CSOps is going to do. It's all the in-depth projects that are essential, and you're so frustrated because you don't have the time to do them, the CSOps. It's just his job because he's not in contact with the users. And so his job is just to put oil in the wheels of the CSM team so that it works better.
It's that ally you have where when you've got a team, you've got the people in the field, and then you've got the person stashed away in the truck behind who articulates everything so that all the buddies in the field do the job properly. And finally, you're a little bit how... I could have called myself the tourist agency, but I don't know if people have the age-based ORF.
A question I've seen asked, and which is perhaps one of the most pertinent, is that we have a CSOps, which is very good, who works on subjects we'd like to work on, but in the end, we don't have the time to do so. If the CSOps isn't there, how do we know that the CSOps is doing its job properly? How do we measure its performance? And above all, how effective is he or she within the team?
That's a very good question indeed. How are you going to implement the success plan of the first 6 months? Basically, when you're going to welcome and onboard this person, it's going to involve a number of things. Obviously, you're going to put this person through the mill of your company's classic onboarding process so that they understand the ins and outs of what you're selling, the ecosystem in which you're operating, the personas with which customer success managers have to deal on a daily basis, the different struggles of the various departments, the history of the company. So obviously that's the more traditional onboarding. After that, the first few months have to have a deadline for success so that you know whether it's worth it or not. In our case, it was a question of finding a tool that could help us move on to the next stage. The next stage in Elisabeth's success in our case was the adoption of practice brands by the team. This was very complicated since we were making her accountable for something that wasn't necessarily directly part of her practice. We had to make sure that the CSMs, the teammates, were going to adopt all this. So that was part of the performance measurement. The next step was to revisit the playbooks. Everything automated is communication. So it's going to be the open rates, the click rates, the actions. What action you're going to implement for each playbook depends on the objective of the communication sent to the customer. If you wanted him to perform an action because he was a bit slippy or things like that, It's the success rate of these campaigns to make sure that behind there's iteration, we kill, and we iterate.
If you don't mind, Kristell, I'd like to add a small element. In fact, the success KPI is part of the project managed by the CSOps. Is the objective achieved? Is it being achieved more? Is there a higher percentage of success than before? What are the CSOps best practices, Kristell? How do you work well with the CSOps?
Clearly, there's still a question of timing in terms of maturity when you start onboarding such a person. If you do it too early, you won't have drafted the elements of success for this person and therefore for the pod. When the time comes for a perf review, you won't be able to say whether it was a success or a failure to create this position. In fact, from your point of view, it's really a matter of asking yourself the questions, listing everything that's going wrong, and is OPS the right answer or not? For me, in any case, that's already the introspection you need to make as a decision maker. And in the other direction, and I've already said this, but I'll say it again, for me, the best practices of a CSOps are over documentation, over communication, over review. There's a side to not taking anything for granted, working with data on an almost weekly basis, because what's more, in low touch, if you don't have reliable and consistent data, you're screwed and you can't articulate everything you want to articulate as a pair, lead and ops. So it's really this ability to iterate, to be able to throw out things that haven't worked for a quarter. We had a discussion with Elie about iterating, keeping it, killing it. Sorry, certain projects. For me, this is one of the best practices expected of this duo more than of you or me.
What's also important to say is that we see each other on a weekly basis, just as you have weekly exchanges with the other CSMs. We put things on the table and work together to decide what needs to be communicated to the CSM and what needs to be communicated to the other departments. So it's really a case of working hand in hand.
After that, it depends on the company, but in any case, my direct reports are weekly one-on-ones. That goes without saying, and it's very subject specific. A one-on-one is no longer about management, but a one-on-one is about supporting the employee, whatever his or her role, to make sure he or she is doing well, and so on. In particular, if they're in a trial period, to confirm their successes or areas for improvement. And then behind that, we roll out the various projects in a general way. So yes, whatever happens, especially in a semi-remote culture like ours, is really essential.
Kristell, what skills are required to recruit a CSOps? I'd like to explain this question in two parts. Before I arrived, what were you thinking? What skills did you think were essential? And now that you've got a CSOps, what are the skills you didn't know you needed?
So there aren't a lot of skills I was hoping for and would go from my list. As I said earlier, and I'm going to repeat it a lot, but it's really the data-driven side, making sure you have reliable data, understanding it, being able effectively to articulate exchanges with the data team if you're lucky enough to have one. We're lucky enough to have one. I thought this was essential, and it was confirmed after recruitment. One of the questions, perhaps I'll answer one of the questions. In my opinion, it was essential to have experience in customer success to save time. Quite simply, to save weeks downboarding, I needed to avoid re-explaining to the person the ins and outs of customer success, the difference with support, with sales, what's low touch, what's high touch, what a customer day is, etc. That's why in my case, and once again, I'm only speaking for myself, I found it relevant to have one person, Elisabeth, to name but one, who had not only been a customer success manager in the past, but who was also a tool for a customer success manager if you know her background. It's true that these two worked in Elisabeth's favor in my case. Of course, you need to understand the product, which can be learned very quickly. But in any case, in my case, the sensitivity to the world you're in, SaaS in my case, seemed to me to be essential. I know that there are customers in B2B, in B2C, etc., but they're not all the same. It's not done in the same way. In my case, having someone who had already been in B2B SaaS was also a time saver. As I was saying, understanding the approach you're going to adopt according to your business model. Is it low touch, high touch, or a mix of all that? Someone obviously in soft skills who is square, organized, with very clear communication about what they expect. And why is that? Because if you're anything like me, you need someone who, when they arrive at this one-on-one meeting, already has all their subjects covered and tells you, this is for information, I'm expecting something from you, and so on. They're a source of ideas. They roll out the cable, if you'll pardon the expression, and you make progress. Because this frees up your time as a lead to make progress on the strategic subjects on which you're challenged by your boss. In this case, the CEO.
Top. Thank you, Kristell. Just before taking questions, I'd like to take this opportunity to send you a communication, a documentation, which is interesting. I'm sending it to you in the chat section on the study of ops profile salaries. I see that there were 11 votes on this question, and I don't know if Kristell will be able to give the average salary of an ops person. I confess I'm not super comfortable with her answering either.
I don't have the average. I only know one. In this case, I don't have the average.
I'm sending you this documentation, which is really interesting and quite accurate. I suggest we move on to questions. Kristell, what is the scope of a CSOps versus a head of? How do you ensure that there is no risk of cannibalization of tasks? That's a good question, as we raised it during our perf review with Kristell.
I think you really wanted to, or at least it was one of your fears, and you wanted to make sure that everyone stayed in their place and in their rightful place. What's interesting in this case, though, is that if you're up against it, it's hard to verify until you've tried. Fortunately, there are trial periods. First of all, if you have a job desk, that limits the risks. Secondly, as a general rule, at least from the profiles I've seen and from the person I've recruited, an ops person doesn't necessarily have an appetite for management. It's not the same thing. For a start, Elisabeth isn't in charge of all my CSM team leads at all. In any case, in our case, there's never been any lack of clarity about any of this. In my case, and in the case of a structure like Agorapulse, you need people who take the initiative and just put you in the loop, who say, I'm going to try this for 3 weeks and I'll tell you if it works or if it doesn't. And in my opinion, that's what you expect when you take on a quality CSOps who's not just operational, but has strategic input without stepping on your toes, as long as it's aligned with the big rocks. In other words, if my company's big rocks / my department, normally everything's aligned, it's going to be by chance. I'll take a Sun City example. Old legacy plans, we've got this challenge at the moment, and if it arrives, as has already been the case with a proposal force on such and such a subject, it will never be something that goes against what I'm asking for, because there's an alignment. So from the moment you set the direction and vision, you're not going to step on each other's toes. My role is how to put it,
is to define the lines. What's that? It's to define the lines and help the teams achieve those lines. Exactly. You dig the trenches and I'll build in the trenches.
Exactly. It's a very good analogy in the end, and especially as a head of, when it's a job CSOps that's never been there before, if you don't do it properly, you're not going to create legitimacy for the customer success manager in place. And that's essential, Because if you don't, the teams will react in the mode of, who the hell is this chick here bothering me because I've got backlogged tasks on my customer success tool, and so on. No, in fact, it's an ops job, just as we've also implemented it in support, etc., for other subjects. But clearly defining a job desk and what that person's success is going to look like over 6 months, 12 months, etc., will enable you to avoid this kind of thing. Normally, if it's been well written and well defined, you don't step on the wrong things.
I suggest you move on to the second question. Joren, can you tell us in the chat if we've answered your question about the CS Ops and head of perimeter? Kristell, do you have any idea what differentiates a CS Ops from a RevOps?
Feet. That's a very good question, and it's true that the reporting line on this, depending on the company you're in, can make a difference. At our company, we've decided that you report to me, so you don't report on the marketing or RevOps side. For the moment, the RevOps side is very much newbie-oriented. At the moment, the RevOps side is very much newbie-oriented, at least for us, essentially, where all the CSOps efforts are aimed at helping us to retain and expand. I know that depending on the company, expansion can be driven by ESLs or CS. As far as we're concerned, we're all about retention and expansion, the two key words. So in the end, we agree that, of course, expansion is part of income. For the moment, we've decided to. So that doesn't mean that they don't paint themselves at all, quite the contrary. I just don't think there's a right way to do it. It's like everywhere else. As I said earlier, some people expand at ESLs, others at CS. For the moment, marketing, ESL SOPs, which continues the other 2/3 of RevOps, are essentially and fully focused on bringing in newbies while we're in retention and expansion.
At CS Ops, we're fighting the same war, but the battles are different. Of course we are. I've had the opportunity to exchange views with all the other ops people in the company and said, let's talk about common issues. And in fact, the subjects are so much niche subjects specific to each department, that in the end, at least with us, the exchange of all ops staff together, except for best practices on tools or optimization, has no place in our company to date. Now, Adele, perhaps you can tell us more about the tasks and expectations of a RevOps in your company. And maybe Kristell can tell you more about how a RevOps might relate to a CSOps. I'll let you answer in the chat, Adele, if you like. We'll move on to the next question. A question from William, who had to leave. At what point is it advisable to have a CSOps number of customers ARR?
That's a very good question. I think there's a plethora of documentation on this. I'll just talk about my own experience. The trigger for this decision was not the number of customers nor a particular ARR, but rather my ability to do or not to do it. To do or precisely not to do. These micro tasks ops, I think I was doing about 5% of what I expected the next person to do. Obviously, depending on where you are in your customer size, it's no secret to say that at Agorapulse, we now have 8,000 paying customers. We have this challenge of having both mid-market and self-service. We have this dual approach here. From the moment you start building a team, in my case at least, a team of dedicated customer success managers who can't manage without automation. You don't have the bandwidth to implement these things. When you do it, you don't do it very well. That was my trigger. My trigger wasn't a number. My trigger was finally an experience. And one day in several, roughly 18 months, when I had to run into walls to understand that it was time,
Don't hesitate to elaborate if we haven't fully answered your questions. Have you seen any positive impacts on the upsell cycle, improving collaboration, filling your CRM, etc.? Question from William again, who had to leave the meeting.
Yes, William, I've obviously seen positive impacts on all this already, because I have a person whose mindset it is every morning to get up and check that we have active updaters on our customer success management tool. Planet not to mention it in our case, to actually make sure that the tasks are up to date, who questions both the renewal managers and the customer success manager high touch on, I set this up 2 weeks ago, does it work and does it not work? So yes, I've seen some positive impacts. I've also seen positive impacts because we're really starting to track, to set up dashboards, something I didn't have the time for. At last, we've got our tool filled in properly. It's not a CRM, etc. I'd also like to say that we've made a lot of progress. I'd also like to say that this success has been twofold. My human resource, Elisabeth, and my tool resource, because there's also the very important question of adherence to good practices and to the tool. If the tool you've selected keeps pace and doesn't fart all over the place, in which case you'll have a team that doesn't want to.
Again, don't hesitate to say in the chat if the question has been answered or if you have any additional questions. When you started recruiting, Kristell, what type of job did you have?
It must be a delivery. It's the vagaries of live work.
Profiling were you looking for in a CS Ops? So how many years of experience? What kind of CV did you receive? It has to be said that Kristell and I found each other on Slack Customer Success, so it was a bit of a chance meeting. But then there was this job you'd posted for a CS Ops, and that's why I came to bother you. But what kind of profile and how many years of experience were you looking for when you started your search? Question from William.
Well, you're looking for something that doesn't exist. You're looking for the dodo, this animal that doesn't exist or that would have existed. It's complicated because you draw up your job description, put in a title, and you get candidates who in most cases haven't had that job because it's so recent. It's true that I've had quite a hard time of it, I have to admit. Basically, it's former CSMs who are going to apply for this job, and that's quite logical in itself. In any case, I was moderately surprised. Type of profile, the experience line, honestly, it's such a recent job unless you have a track record having been a CSO. If you're lucky enough to have someone who's already been a CSO in the past, it's going to be ultimately, and I'm going back to the beginning, this person's ability to have an understanding of either the customer success field or the ecosystem you're in. In my case, having worked in SaaS B2B was a huge plus in terms of time gained. The questions asked in the interview are also extremely important. If the person is already thinking about how their success is going to be measured, how they're going to articulate their position with the different people in the team, that's going to be crucial. Their interest in data, I know I'm repeating myself a lot, but if they're actually asking questions about whether there's a data team, whether things have already been set up in this area or whether I'm starting from scratch, etc., that's going to be crucial. Because it's the same in terms of timing and maturity. If you don't have any data at all to measure, your CSO will be twiddling his thumbs because there won't be any material. And it's ultimately this that will enable you to see if the quantitative questions are relevant. And it's true that when someone asks you a question, and I was replying to Elisabeth at the time, we've got so much data, I don't even know what to do with it, but it's precisely this person that I need. And to see the stars in the eyes of the person who knows that they're going to be able to literally have fun with what they've got, it's also a good sorting tool. It's very complicated, to be honest. Recruiting customer success managers is pretty easy now. As for recruiting a CSO, I make no secret of the fact that I was very happy to be in contact with Elisabeth.
I'd like to take this opportunity to promote CS Job Corner. If you're looking for a CS Ops, don't hesitate to check out CS Job Corner. I'll give you the URL. I really don't think you need to be in the same country as the person to do CS Ops. You don't have to be. Feel free to check out this site to look for your next recruitment. I've also put up a poll. Are there people who want to become CS Ops? You're welcome to respond. It'll also tell us whether you're in this webinar to recruit or to join a company. I'll take a look at the responses. If any of you are interested, please don't hesitate to contact me so I can answer your questions. I'd be delighted to. We'll move on to Fanny's next question. Any tips for adopting the elements put in place by CS Ops? Getting CSMs to use the tool? I'll answer if that's okay with you, Christine. What's been your secret? Being the CSM of CSMs. We set up an exchange system. Getting CSMs to use the tools is a very clear question. First of all, it means identifying the bread. Why do we need to use a tool? Follow a change management process using the ADCAR methodology. Awareness. Why is the way we work no longer working? Ideally, what would you like to do? The desire part. Then the knowledge part. Desire, knowledge, awareness, assessment, and reiteration. The idea is first to explain, to make people understand why the way we used to work doesn't work anymore. This is exactly what you do with your customers during the onboarding phase. The way we used to work doesn't work anymore. Ideally, we'd like to do that. We need this tool. We're learning how it works. We check in regularly to make sure it's being adopted. Then we iterate. Right now, we're in a phase with Agorapulse CSM where we're iterating again and again. We'll never be done iterating on how best to help them. The part that has helped us a lot is making an individual point with each CSM and sending them forms on a recurring basis to tell them what's going well in the tool today, what's not, what's your daily routine. The challenge, the biggest challenge of CS Ops as a general rule is that we don't know, we can't give an answer to what we don't know. In our case, little automation had been done before I joined the company. When I asked the CSM, what automation would you like to implement? In fact, they didn't tell me any, even though it was obviously necessary because they'd never implemented any. Kristell and I were looking at each other at the last Engage event where we were talking about digital CS and automation. And a lot of people were saying, no, I can't automate my processes. Whereas it's perfectly possible to automate them. You just need to take a step back. And it's also the CSM's job to get the team to take a step back from their day-to-day work, analyze the bottleneck, and find a solution together.
And if I may add something, where the CSO will be the good buddy, in the end, the CSM who listens to the CSMs and says, what's your day-to-day pain? What's the repetitive task you'd like to get rid of? The lead, the head of, is going to be a little more the bad cop and is going to make adherence to these good practices, these tools, and in any case, collaboration with the CSO, an element of customer success performance. In other words, after a while in performance review, if you're too far behind on these issues and you haven't been, how shall I put it, you haven't played the game, this could be seen as a performance concern. Really, there's a carrot and stick aspect where the CSO will say, I'm your ally, I'm here to make your life easier. And as a manager and as a lead, we're also there to remind you of the rules of the game. You're on the ground, but you've got to play the game. So there's this interesting balance between the op, good cop, and the lead, a little more bad cop sometimes when necessary, precisely to counterbalance, because sometimes they can be a little hard-headed.
Absolutely. Fanny, has your question been answered? I don't know if Fanny's still here. Fanny's still here. Thank you for that very full answer. Half of nothing. Question from Chloe. Who does CSF refer to? RevOps, head of CS, or something else? I think the question before was pretty clearly answered. Personally, I refer completely to Kristell. On the other hand, Kristell, to complete the answer, it would be quite interesting to talk about collaboration with other departments. And who do I refer to? Who does the CSF refer to? When there's cross-departmental collaboration?
Yes, as I was saying earlier, one of the qualities of the person in charge of the CSO will be to break down silos, if you'll pardon the expression. And this is something that Elisabeth was very capable of. And that too is one of the qualities you'll be looking for. We all know how little the departments talk to each other. And indeed, of course, I'm her direct report. There's no question about that. But the CSO will have to work with the head of product marketing, for example. We've already talked a lot about this, marketing and pure sales. It goes without saying, to ensure good handover practices and so on. Finally, I think that apart from finance, there's no department you don't work with product. It goes without saying, to automate the product feedbacks we receive in the various forms sent out. Beyond direct reporting, we'll say from a charter's point of view, yes, I'm her direct report. And obviously, I'm in the loop, in the root of all the projects she works on. I'm at least in the eye. But what I think is interesting and exciting about this kind of job is that, quite frankly, apart from finance, I don't think there's a department you haven't spoken to.
Yes, but the CSM too. The CSM must also be in all departments. I'd also add that it's important to always keep the head of CS in the loop, at least as far as I'm concerned, because at the end of the quarter, if a task hasn't been done or a project hasn't been completed, it's important to say, yes, but my role today, the focus was that. And we agreed. In fact, it keeps you on track.
It's the alignment, it's the big rocks. And if we say to ourselves this quarter, we've got to focus on educating our customers on such and such a subject, we've got to do it. I don't know what kind of challenge you're going to have. I don't know if you're working with hockey players, with big rocks, etc., depending on the box. But normally you have to align the planets, which means that any initiative you take has to be in some way in line with what you've agreed in the end. So if your CSA pulls you out of those boxes or something that has nothing to do with the big rocks, it means that the job of setting out what you need to work on for the next 3 months hasn't been done. And that's sometimes the pitfall you can fall into. In the end, it's bringing them in, it's recruiting a person without having properly mapped out what you need for the next 3 months, the first 6 months. So there you have it, the palette of tests and then the rest.
Great. Listen, thank you very much, Kristell. There are a lot of interesting questions, but I'm seeing a lot of repetition of what Kristell has already answered. So I suggest you stop there. If you're on the customer success Slack, Kristell is there too. I'm there too. Thank you very much, Kristell, for sharing this short hour with us. Thank you all so much for your responsiveness. It was very dynamic. So thank you very much. The recording will be available on the Planet Customer Success YouTube channel. And then on our side, we'll see you next month for another webinar. If I'm not being silly, it'll be on the success of a customer success team. You'll find the link to register for the event on the Customer Success Slack. And the very next day on LinkedIn, posted thanks to Agorapulse. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Kristell. Thank you, Elisabeth, for the invitation. Have a good day. Have a good week. Goodbye. Goodbye.